We'll be having the next in our series with Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, ABA President Dennis Archer, Civil Rights Attorney Julius Chambers, and Justice Richard Goldstone, who was instrumental in the breakdown of apartheid in South Africa. Today it is with great pleasure that we welcome John Hope Franklin as our next Great Lives in the Law speaker. In so doing, the program on public law branches out from distinguished lawyers and jurists to a person who, while not a lawyer himself, has had profound influence on law at a time critical in our country's history. Through his published work, Dr. Franklin has brought needed attention to some of our country's bleakest chapters. As a distinguished scholar, he has been active in promoting legal change. As a teacher, he has inspired many students and colleagues to delve deeper into the causes and remedies of inequality, bigotry, and oppression. I will leave it up to this conversation between Professor Dellinger and Dr. Franklin to enable you to learn more about the life of this great and distinguished historian. Let me just say that Dr. Franklin is James B. Duke Professor Emeritus of History here at Duke, and for 7 years taught a legal history course at Duke Law School with Walter and Bill Luchtenberg, which was one of the most popular courses we have ever had. He was born in Rentisville, Oklahoma on January 2, 1915, and this spring, January 2005, the John Hope Franklin Center here at Duke will be commemorating his 90th birthday with what I understand is going to be a month-long birthday party. He earned degrees from Fisk and Harvard, and he has taught at Fisk, St. Augustine's, Howard, North Carolina College, Brooklyn College, the University of Chicago, and of course here at Duke. He has written many important books. He's probably best known worldwide for his famous and influential From Slavery to Freedom, which is currently in its 8th edition and has been translated into Indian, Japanese, German, French, Portuguese, and Chinese, and sold over 3 million copies. He advised the NAACP's Thurgood Marshall in the historic Brown versus Board litigation. He served as chair of President Clinton's One America Initiative on Race, and in 1995, President Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In addition to that award, the highest award our country bestows on a civilian, he has received more than 100 honorary degrees. He loves opera and symphony, and perhaps most of all, orchids. In fact, one of his greatest, perhaps his most fond honor, is that an orchid has been named after him, which is described as a long-stemmed white flower with a crimson-red lip. Like Franklin, the plant is tall and slender, stately, and graceful. Joining in this conversation with Dr. Franklin is a member of our own faculty, Walter Dellinger, a great life in the law in his own right. Professor Dellinger is the Douglas Maggs Professor of Law. Born and raised in North Carolina, he earned his degrees at UNC Chapel Hill and Yale. He then clerked for Justice Hugo Black on the Supreme Court and has taught at the University of Mississippi before coming to Duke. Among many other distinctions, he served in the Clinton administration as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Office of Legal Counsel and as the country's Solicitor General. He is now building the Supreme Court practice and appellate practice at O'Melveny & Myers in D.C. No orchid has yet been named for him, but he has left many Supreme Court arguments smelling like a rose. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. He's argued 17 cases in the Supreme Court, and the list grows every year. He has at least one other this term, and he's currently on everyone's short list of possible Supreme Court appointees in a Kerry administration. We are proud to have both of these individuals as part of our Duke community, and we welcome them here today for this Great Lives conversation.
It was a Sunday afternoon in the mid-1980s when I saw in the local paper that John Hope Franklin was speaking on the campus at UNC on his work in progress, a book on George Washington Williams. I went over to hear him, and I was spellbound. And as I walked back home, I thought about a course I had where I taught the debates at the Constitutional Convention, to which we'd appended a segment by William Leuchtenberg on the New Deal and the crisis over the Supreme Court. And I thought, what's missing is the middle period, the 14th Amendment, the Civil War, Lincoln and habeas corpus. With that addition, we would have a full range of constitutional history. So I arranged to meet Dr. Franklin and ask would he like to become a junior law professor. He agreed, and for 7 years, we had what was the most wonderful experience of my life, except that I've learned never co-teach a class with someone where students cry at the end of your co-teacher's lectures. John Hope, what did you learn from your father?
I learned many things from my father. My father was a lawyer who had not been to law school. He read law and took a correspondence course and passed the law. I learned from him diligence, hard work, absolute commitment to his profession, a feeling about his profession that was at once practical and romantic. He liked to say that law was a jealous mistress. He liked to say that he wouldn't take certain cases because he regarded it as unethical. He liked to say that the law was the avenue by which one became not only civilized, but really made into a citizen. So that I learned a great deal from him. Finally, I learned that you couldn't do anything without hard work, and if hard work was rewarding, he certainly should have been extraordinarily wealthy.
Was there a viable law practice for him in Rentsville?
No, there was not a viable
What was that town law? What was that town law?
In Rentsville, he was there. That was an all-black town, which did not have as many people in this town as we have here at in this classroom. So after having been the justice of the peace, the postmaster, and the editor of the Rentsville News all at one time, and founder of the Rentsville Trading Company, not on the New York Stock Exchange, he decided that it was not viable, and that's when he moved to Tulsa in February 1921, leaving my mother and my sister and me there to complete that school term, and then we would move to Tulsa in the summer of 1921. My other two siblings were away in boarding school in Tennessee, and so there were three of us there, my sister and my mother and I, and we stayed there. We would go up in June, but after we packed and were ready, and my father was going to come for us, we were not able to get any message from him. He didn't come that morning. He didn't come the next morning or the next or the next. And then my mother found, by reading the newspaper that had been dropped off by the Katy Railroad that ran through this village, she learned that there was a race riot in Tulsa, and there were many casualties, and that the black section of town had been leveled. There was nothing left. And so we didn't know, we certainly didn't know whether he was living or dead. And it was only after we got a message from him, a short message, saying that he was not harmed, but he had been detained in Convention Hall with several hundred other people for several days, and he just got out. But by that time, he was so busy with his clients, suing the city, suing the state, suing everybody inside, insurance companies, losing all the cases ultimately. But he didn't have the fare to come to see us, to say nothing of moving us. So it was 4 more years in Rentersville, and I started school there.
What did you learn from your mother?
I learned from my mother something of the same thing, but she was a different kind of person. With remarkable equanimity and poise and I would think charm, but that's probably subjective. But I learned from her that you couldn't do anything unless you worked hard. Worked hard at whatever it was you did. And I learned from her too that you must direct your energies in the proper route and not on some frivolous, meaningless activity, and certainly not on something that would get you down if you didn't direct your energies properly. For example, when I was 6 years old, the same year that we were supposed to move to Tulsa, we one morning got on the train and we had to flag the train. It didn't stop in Tulsa unless someone was getting off or someone was getting on. And it would throw the mail. You get the mail and the newspapers down on the ground, and then the postmaster would pick them up. We got on the train going to shop in a small town not far, about 6 miles away, Chakota. And the train stopped. We got on, and then we sat down. By that time, the train is moving. And the conductor came by and he said, "You can't sit in this coach. This coach is for white people." And my mother said very firmly, "Well, you don't expect me to move my small children while the train is moving, not from one coach to another." He said, "I'll stop the coach." He stopped it. And instead of moving us to the next coach, he put us off by this time we were out in the woods. And I began to cry. And my mother said, what are you crying about?" I said, "The man, he put us off the train." She said, "Oh, that? You don't cry about that." She said, "They put us off, that's the law. He put us off the train because we wouldn't move to the next coach. And the next coach is for black people. And it's a way of his making the distinction between black and white. But that doesn't make the distinction between good and bad. There's no person on that train, no white person on that train who's any better than you. And here you are crying. You shouldn't waste your energy doing that. You should waste your energy proving that you're as good as anyone on that train." She said, "Now don't let me see you crying again about something artificial like this." And I said, "Yes, that's it." So throughout my life, with all the humiliations, I have learned not to cry but to laugh at those crazy people. Those sick people who think that there's a distinction based on race.
How old were you when you went to Fisk?
16. I was 16. I finished high school at 16. I went to college immediately.
What were the Fisk years like? You were a smart ass, I'll bet.
No.
I've seen pictures of you. I didn't make that up. I've seen pictures of a very smug young man, I think.
That's one thing I also learned, to be smug. That's a camouflage for this disdain I have for certain people. But at Fisk, we were poor. Don't forget, this is 1931. It's the middle of the Depression. My father's, if we could have spelled it, he was bankrupt. He had no money. His clients were very few. So I had to work 2 jobs when I went to Fisk. I had a scholarship, but that was just for tuition. And I had to eat and sleep and And there were all kinds of other things. So I had 2 jobs. I worked 2 jobs the entire time. And that meant that I had to husband my energies and my time, especially after I met Dellinger in October 1931.
Did that lead to anything?
It led to 9 years of courtship and 58 years of marriage.
Right.
And so I had to be careful that I wouldn't fritter my time away with something unimportant. So that the 2 important things were my classes and my extracurricular activities and my girlfriend. And I gave proper attention, I hope, to all 3 things.
How did it come about that you got from Fisk to the graduate program in history at Harvard?
Well, there was a young white professor at Fisk named Theodore Correa who came into a course, it's the survey course on American civilization. He gave a lecture, and it was very exciting. I'd never heard history put that way. I said, I think I'd better look into him, and I decided to take a course with him. And I took a course my 2nd year at Fisk, and that changed my life entirely. He was this young man who was full of history. It was just overflowing. You could see it. I was so excited myself. I was just caught up in the whole study of history. And by the end of that 2nd year, I had decided not to go to law school, which I had committed myself to, not because of my father, but I just wanted to go to law school and come back and join him so that I could lift him up, and make him at least, if not affluent, at least solvent. And so in the summer of 1933, I said to my father, I went down to his office, I said, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't think I'm going to be a lawyer. He said, that was your idea in the first place. So I never suggested you to be a lawyer. And I said that you don't understand that I was going to be a lawyer, but now I have to be a historian. I know what I want to do with my life. He said, great. He said, great. I hope you're successful. It's all your mother and I ever wanted you to do was to be successful. Do the best you can in whatever area you're going to pursue, and we'll be proud of you. He said, I'll be proud of you if you're a great historian. I'd be proud of you if you're a great lawyer. Just be great. Just be great. So I can be proud of you. And that's what I did. Now back to Courier. When he learned, and he's a young man, he's only, when I met him, I was 16 and he was 28. So he was just very much in my class, I thought. And we became very close friends. And when he realized that I wanted to be a historian, and this is a small institution, just 2 people teaching history, he decided he would shape his courses to make certain that I would have the experiences that I needed to go on to graduate school. So he gave seminars. He had colloquia. He had reading courses. He had research courses. Everything to prepare me to go to Harvard. And it was Harvard. And I didn't know of any other graduate school because he didn't let me know of any other graduate school. I had to go to Harvard. And so at the spring of my senior year, at the fall of my senior year, I applied to Harvard. Did I apply to any other place? No. He said, that's it, you go to Harvard. And I supposed that I would go to Harvard. But I wasn't able to go anywhere, you see. We had lost our home. My father and mother were living in an apartment which he had built, and he thought that he could get some income from the apartment, even if we lost our home. So we lived in 2 of those 4 families apartment units, and rented out the other 2. And he simply wasn't able to send me away to graduate school. And that summer, I worked, the summer between my senior year and the future, whatever it's going to be. I worked a bit. And then I went home, and Ted Courier, Professor Courier, called me. He said, "How are you doing?" By this time, I'd been admitted to law school, to graduate school. And I was admitted without condition. The first African American to be admitted without condition from a historically black institution at Harvard University. Put that in your cap, you know. And they thought that, they wrote me this in a letter. It was a great compliment, but no money, no fellowship, no scholarship. I should be happy that I'm admitted without having to take freshman English as Du Bois had to take in 1890 when he went there. I didn't have to take freshman English. I had the English, but I didn't have the money. So Ted Courier called me in September of 1935 and said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm doing all right, but I don't have any money, and I can't go to Harvard, and I haven't prepared to do anything else." I didn't want to lay on him any burden of responsibility, since he had advised me not to take any teacher training courses and that sort of thing, and I was not prepared even to teach. So he said, "Can you get your fare to Nashville?" Where he was. And I said, "Yes, I think so." He said, "Well, you get your fare to Nashville and come on here." And I went to Nashville. And I stayed with him that night. And the next morning he said, "I'm going downtown. You stay here till I come back." He went down and he came back and he had $500 in his hand. And he put it in my hand and he said, "Money won't keep you out of Harvard." And with that, I got on the train that night and went to Harvard and registered the next day. I don't know when I realized it, but I realized at some point that he projected himself in me. Mm-hmm. He had not even completed his PhD at Harvard. He'd been there. Very bright, Phi Beta Kappa in his junior and all that, but not disciplined enough to do what was important and necessary to take a PhD. And here I am, I've got to do what he didn't do. And so I proceeded to try to do it.
Was that your first time in the North?
No, I'd been in the North twice before with the Fisk University choir. I'd made the choir my first week at Fisk. And I sang with the choir the entire time I was at Fisk. And so we took a tour and performed in various places, including Carnegie Hall. How many of you can boast that, you know? And then I'd been with the debating team. One of the things that Ted Courier did, he was the coach of the debating team at Fisk. He not only pitted us against historically black colleges, but also against historically white colleges. So I debated when I was a junior at Fisk, I was debating Notre Dame and New York University and places like that. And that's when I began to realize that, you know, these boys are white, but they're just somebody else, you know. Mm-hmm. And I can take them on. I can handle them. And that was an experience that was very important for me when I got to Cambridge.
What was race at Harvard like in the 1930s?
Race at Harvard was it was something that I realized that I was African American, but not in any crude or rude sense. I wasn't treated poorly in any rude sense. the first experience I had was with anti-Semitism. Now, I didn't know that one white person was different from another. I didn't know it. Mm-hmm. They're just white. And all I had to do was to struggle to, get somewhere despite them. And it was when I was at Harvard my first year, and I was very active in the Henry Adams Club, the club of graduate students in American history, that I learned that white people were different from each other. And I learned it in a very remarkable and somewhat crude way. I was appointed, I didn't know then what I know now, but I was appointed as a member of the nominating committee to nominate people for offices for Henry Adams Club the next year. On the nominating committee, I was taken care of, you see. But I didn't know that. I thought that was because I was active and prominent and so forth, that they wanted me on it. But then I would be the president, vice president, secretary, anything else if I'm on the nominating committee. So when we made our report, they said, when we met, they said, well, whom should we have a president? And I said, well, who else? No, Oscar Hamlin. He's a straight A record, exempted from his PhD exams because he has a straight A record. He's an active member of this club, and so forth. Dead silence. Dead silence. It seemed like an eternity. It probably was a minute. Then someone said, well, he doesn't have all of the obnoxious attributes of a Jew, but he's still a Jew. I don't even know what they're talking about. I simply don't know what they're talking about. A Jew? What's that? Who is that? And I'm dumbfounded. I can't even argue. I can't argue the point because I don't know what it's about. So my candidate fell by the wayside, and they elected the president of that club, a young white man who didn't even pass his exams, his PhD exams when he got to them. And he never got his PhD. Oscar Hamlin, of course, he won the Pulitzer Prize, became the Carl Schwartzheim Professor, University Professor at Harvard. And they were worried about the fact that he was a Jew. That's one thing I discovered. The other thing I realized when I was in my second year at Harvard, and by that time I had fellowships and was then forbidden to work.
And why?
You cannot hold money. You cannot have money at Harvard and work. You're
right.
Supposed to devote all your. They paid for you, so you do it. You go to the library. Now, these other young men who made the same record that I did, some better, some worse, were teaching assistants to the professors. They were jealous of me because I didn't have to work. I was jealous of them because they were working. And they had the teaching. They were getting the teaching experience that I didn't get. And I realized that I was. They gave me a fellowship. One of the reasons they gave me a fellowship, I suppose I earned it in terms of my grades, but it was also because then I didn't have to go in the classroom and teach. There were no African Americans in history at Harvard but me anyway. But beyond that, there were no black teaching assistants anywhere in the university system. No one was teaching. So then I began to realize that that's why I was favored the way I was. And then it meant that when I got out, I didn't have any teaching experience except one I could pick up here.
You wrote your dissertation on the free Negro in North Carolina, 1840, what was the period?
1790 to 1860, free Negroes in North Carolina, 1790 to 1860.
Did you Did you think about consciously whether you wanted to choose a racial topic? Did anybody advise you? Did you think about whether you should, in that setting, do Bismarck and the fall of the Ottoman Empire or whatever? Or was that a choice point for you?
It was a matter that I had given some thought to. You have to remember that I'm fairly young.
Yes.
I was 20, 21. I was 20 when I went to Harvard. And there are a lot of things I didn't know, like about the Jews. But I wasn't certain about what I wanted to do. In my first seminar, the first year I was there, first fall I was there, the professor said in the seminar, here are a group of subjects I want you to write on. They talked to these 12 or 14 people in the room. And he read out some subjects. And I heard a subject, I heard the name of a subject, I heard a subject that I thought would be very interesting. It was Lyman Abbott and the Social Gospel. And I said, when he got to me, I said, I'd like to write on Lyman Abbott and the Social Gospel. And then a student later who probably wasn't listening, wasn't paying much attention, when it got to him, he said, I want to write on Lyman Abbott and the Social Gospel. And the professor said, well, that's been taken. And he turned to me, unless you would like to write on Booker T. Washington, or something like that. I said, no, I want to write on Lyman Abbott. And I said, I will not be typed. You're not going to type me, not now. And so I became sensitive on that subject. And so then I began to wonder what I would do for a doctoral dissertation, and I got to that level. I'd taken British history. It was very enamored of it. Yes. And then one of the things I did to earn money, I typed a dissertation in British history, British political history in the 18th century. And I thought that was very something, British history. And go to the British Museum and go to the Public Record Office and check things out, that sort of thing. But then here it is, 1936, 7, 8. I can't get my fare into Boston. And it's ridiculous to think that I could ever get to England. So I had to give that up. Then I decided that I would write on, I'd done this paper on Lyman Abbott, and I got involved in Christian socialism and so forth. I thought I would do that until I picked up the paper one day, and there was a book being reviewed by James Dombrowski on the beginnings of Christian socialism, including Lyman Abbott and all the others. So that's out. So what am I going to do? Then I remember that I had written a paper on free Negroes in North Carolina, free Negroes in the antebellum South, for Ted Courier in one of his seminars that he fixed up for me. And I said, that's a very interesting subject. And so I decided that I would write on that. And that's the first foray into what you might call African-American history. I'd never had a course, haven't had a course yet in it, and that sort of thing. But I got involved in that, attached to it, and I wrote this dissertation on the subject.
Why did you go back to the South when you were at Harvard?
Well, when I finished my PhD exams, my general exams before the dissertation, my professor, Paul Buck, my supervisor, said that would I like a fellowship? I said, no, I don't want to. I got enough of that. I don't want any fellowship. I want to go into the South, work, teach, become acclimated once more to the South. I had enough of the North for the time being. Don't want to offend any Northerners in here, but the North wasn't straight either on this whole subject of race. And so I wanted to go back to South, so I did. I felt that this was where I belonged, was where I would have a career, and the sooner I started, the better. There were no places in the north I could get a job anyway.
Right.
See? No teaching, except maybe in some grade school or high school, but certainly no university in the United States, in the northern part. No historically white institution of any kind would have me in the 1930s. So it was the South for me and historically black institutions. So the sooner I got started on that, the better. And that's the reason I went back south in 1939.
All right, tell me about writing from slavery to freedom.
Well,
You're teaching in Raleigh.
I'm teaching in Durham by
Durham.
the time that this matter comes up. But all my research experience still is in Raleigh. But I left Raleigh at St. Augustine's College, where I taught from 1939 to 1943. I left there in 1943 and came to North Carolina College for Negroes. It was called, that's the name of the college. It was not North Carolina Central University, North Carolina College for Negroes. And I was here working, teaching, when by that time I'd published Free Negroes in North Carolina, edited a book on recruiting during the Civil War, and had published 2 or 3 papers in referee journals. So I'm busy trying to make my way in my career. And I get this letter from Roger Shugg, who is the head of the college department at Alfred Knopf, asking me if I would be interested in writing a history of African Americans. And I wrote him back, I said, yes, someday, but not now. I said, I'm busy writing a book on the military tradition in the South. Came out to be later called The Militant South, published by Harvard University Press, but at this time I'm just doing research on it. I'd been swinging all down in the South in the summer of 45. And so I'm full of that. I don't have any time for African Americans. I'm doing this book which will try to do something, explain the chip on the shoulder tradition that I had seen among Southerners. And I'm talking now about Southern whites, not about Southern black. And he said that that was a very interesting subject he wrote me back, said, that's a very interesting subject, but that's so important and so timeless that anytime you give attention to that, it'd be very, very good. We'd be interested in that when you do it. But what we need now is a history of Negroes in the United States. This is just after the war, just when when blacks are getting settled back in, and there's this tradition of struggle during the war itself. And he said, this is very important, and I hope you can be persuaded to do it. And I said, well, I don't know. And I began to show some signs of yielding, I guess. Mm-hmm. When he began to really pounce on me, and he just took advantage of me. Especially when he offered me $500 advance. Advance against royalties, $500. I said, it's irresistible. I can't turn that down, especially coming from what I thought was the most important publisher in the country, Alfred Knopf. And so I accepted it, and they put me under the most remarkable pressure. I signed the contract in the fall of 45. I'm teaching 5 courses, 5 preparations. No office, no carol in the library, no nothing. I can't do anything. And so it's very hard going. I come over to Duke to do a little research. I go to Chapel Hill to do a little research. But that's not satisfactory. As I said in here during the inauguration of the new president a few weeks ago, I pointed out that at Duke, in the library, I have to work in the stacks. Professors would come in the stacks and begin to talk to me, not badger me, but engage me. And I was pleased to be engaged, but I was not pleased to be interrupted in the very short time I would have to do my work in the stacks. They never never invited me to their office, never invited me to sit down and chat with them in the stacks, stand up in the middle of the floor and talk. And so that was not satisfactory. My point is that I had almost nowhere to work. And in the summer of 1946, my wife said, you can't write this book in your lap. We had a small apartment there on Linwood Avenue.
You had a son by then.
No, we didn't have a son then. No. He comes much later.
That's right.
But she said, you cannot finish this book here. I said, well, I don't have no alternative. She said, yes, you do. She was a librarian in the law school at North Carolina College. She said, as long as I'm working, you can be free to finish this book. She said, why don't you go to the Library of Congress and work there? You'll have a study room there and whatnot. And she said, I will send you money every week that you're there, and you'll finish that book. So I took leave without pay from North Carolina College for the first term of 1946-47. That's when I broke the back of that book. Mm-hmm. I worked day in and day out, night in and night out, Sunday in and Sunday out, or almost around the clock. And by April of 1947, I took that manuscript to New York. And Roger Shug told me, he said, if I hadn't been sitting down, I would have fallen out. He said, we told you that we wanted it this spring. He said, but we thought we were going to get it spring after next, maybe. And here it is. He told me that much later. that I didn't realize that that I had any alternative except to finish it. And with the subvention, as I said, from the Aretha Franklin Foundation, I was able to complete the work.
Did you imagine that it would sell 3 million copies?
No, it sold 4 million by
4
now.
million. A million here, a million there, you know.
Yeah. What's a million among friends?
Right.
No, I didn't think. And when it was published, it was not all that well received, you see.
What was the reaction?
Well, the reviewer in the New York Times said it was a stumbling, bumbling job. I didn't know at the time that he was working on one himself, and therefore didn't want anything to get in the way of the acclaim that he hoped his book would get. Unfortunately, he died and did not ever finish the book that he was hoping to finish. It was fairly well received in the Saturday Review of Literature and in the New York Herald Tribune and a few of the other daily newspapers. The professional journals were not very friendly to it. As William Heseltine put it in the Journal of Southern History, it was a remarkably sophisticated way of exaggerating the role of African Americans in American history. But that was Bill Heseltine for you.
But it began to establish your professional reputation.
Well, it began to establish my reputation, and more than that, and credit must be given where credit is due, it was the big push, the big civil rights movement in the 50s, late 50s, and 60s particularly, that it caused this book to just take off, and people couldn't understand. African couldn't understand. They couldn't understand what was happening. They didn't know people were tramping in the streets, marching. They didn't know that people were demanding courses on Negro history in high schools and colleges, that sort of thing. And they were to go in paperback in the spring of 1967, And I said, don't forget that you're going into paperback. They said, well, the book is selling very well, and we've got a corner on the market, and we don't think we're going to go into paperback. And I wrote them back, and I said, you are going on into paper. They suggested to me that if you want to write a short book on the history of African Americans, we'll put that in paper, but not this book. And I wrote them back. I said, let me tell you something. I will never revise this book again unless you put it in paperback. I said, you don't even know what's happening. And I tried to describe to them what was happening. I said, and if you don't put it in paperback, someone's going to come along with a semi-demagogic book and put it in paper and then wipe us all out, wipe us out. I said, but I won't write another book for you. I won't revise this book again ever if you don't put it into paperback. And they said, well, we come to think of it, we'll reconsider the matter. And they brought it out in paperback.
How old were you when you went to Howard?
32 years old.
And I think you once told me that there was something slightly depressing about that. It was a great institution, but you thought this was your life's goal and this was where you would end up.
Yeah, well, Howard University in 1947 was regarded as the capstone of Negro education. That's what people regarded it. So it's described as the capstone of Negro education. And that's where every African-American scholar aspired to go. Now, I was invited to be a full professor at Howard University in 1930, when I was 32 years old in 1947. And I said, this is not yet for me. Why do I want to go to my last job when I'm 32? I'll have to be there for 40 years. I don't want to be anywhere for 40 years. That was my attitude. And I really considered turning them down, but I don't know that anyone had ever turned down a professorship at Howard, and I don't think I was the one to do it. So I reluctantly accepted an invitation to my Senate. I was sentenced for the rest of my life to be at Howard. But I said, I'll have to grin and bear it, hold up some way and be there, remain there, so I wouldn't have anywhere to go. It was a very depressing kind of feeling, a mixed feeling, depression and pleasure.
From there, you know, it was there were wonderful scholars there at the time, and your reputation grew. You gave major refereed papers at international convocations. You gave a major paper in Rome.
Yes.
The American Historical Association, the Southern Historical Association. You were heard delivering papers, and your reputation and your writings grew. And then that led to what was the very dramatic development in American educational history. Hard to recapture for people this young. The next move in Dr. Franklin's life resulted in a story on the front page of the New York Times. An event that would now seem unremarkable to us.
Well, you're right. It's very interesting that the only satisfaction I got at Howard University was in continuing my work, as though I was going somewhere else. I wrote, I published, I did research, I participated in the professional associations and so forth, as though I'm really just going somewhere. I'm not going, I'm just treading waters. But it's very interesting that I was in Rome to read a paper for the International Congress of Historical Sciences in the summer of '55, and there were 3 people there from Brooklyn College. They were not in U.S. history, and I didn't know them. I'd never heard of them, but they were there, and because they were from Brooklyn College, Americans abroad, you know, we became friendly. And we'd go out to dinner together and so forth, and they came to hear me read my paper at Rome. I didn't know that there was a vacancy at Brooklyn College at the time. I came back to this country and was very active in the Southern Historical Association, something very interesting about to develop now. And also very active in the American Historical Association. I read a paper at the American Historical Association in Washington in December of 1955. I looked in the audience, and there were these three people that I had seen at Rome. And these people were there to hear me read my paper. And they said that they were happy to see me there, and I was very happy to see these people rooting for me, my Rome gang, you see. And I welcomed them. Then at the end of the paper, they came down and said that we want you to meet some other people. There were others from Brooklyn College there, some U.S. historians whose names I recognized. And then they said, is it true you're giving a party this afternoon? I said, yes. Can we come? Yes. And so they came out to my house. I don't know why they really wanted to see me socially, but I still knew nothing. Then finally, the next week, I got a letter from one of them saying, look, we've got a vacancy. We hope you're interested. It's the chair of the Department of History, and we're ready to nominate you for that. I was amazed. There were two of my white friends in Washington. That's where I was at Howard University at the time. But two of my white friends at other universities in Washington, America, George Washington, who were interested in that job, and I was coaching them on how to get it. And here I am. I hope they didn't think I was double-crossing them. But I received the invitation, and then, to make a long story short, I was elected by the Board of Education, Board of Higher Education of the city. I did not know how far it had gone until I got a call from the education editor of the New York Times, Benjamin Fine, who said, look, tomorrow morning you're going to be elected professor of history and chairman of the Department of History at Brooklyn College. He said, I know that. And I would like to put an accurate story in the New York Times. He said, it's going to be in the New York Times tomorrow. And it will be accurate or inaccurate depending on whether you're willing to cooperate. I said, what do you want to know? And he asked me questions, and I gave him answers. And so it led to this paper that you mentioned, the newspaper you mentioned, that I was teaching my 8 o'clock class at Howard University one morning, the next morning, and one of my colleagues came into my classroom and held up came down front and held up the newspaper and said, look, and there was my picture on the front page of the New York Times. That's an unlikely development in 2004. No one paid any attention to it, but the fact that it was on the front page shows not how important it was, but how far we had to go in 1955, that an appointment to a job would make the front page of the New York Times. It's enough to make you pause to think how unsavory that was, how terrible that was, that it would make that kind of news in 1955. And yet, that's where we were.
From there,
I'm sorry.
a successful chairmanship, and then on to the University of Chicago and its great history department, where you were chair of the Department of History. You worked with Thurgood Marshall on the brief in Brown versus the Board of Education, lectured, traveled widely in Europe and in Africa, Asia. When you look back from the point of the Brown decision, May 17th, 1954, do you think we've come further than you would have thought or less far on race in America?
We have come less far than I had hoped. And I waver from being sanguine to being pessimistic. I would only say that we're not as far as I would hope. And I say that particularly to an audience like this, young, and think that we've not, we don't have any problems to solve, and we've got there and all that sort of thing. It was brought home to me very dramatically 3 weeks ago when I was lecturing at Brown University, and a young African-American student in the audience got up and said to me at the end of my talk, "Now that we're desegregated, how do you know that you're being discriminated against?" I said, "Just open your eye." Not both of them, just open one eye. And you'll find out, My point being that that we may be better off in some ways, but as long as we have more blacks in jail than are in college, as long as we have more blacks in unemployed than we have in college, as long as we have a system which will not provide adequate and decent, affordable housing even for people who can afford it, we're not very far. And I saw a list yesterday of black millionaires, very impressive, and blacks who are head of major corporations in this country, very impressive for those blacks. But what does that mean to the vast numbers who are not anywhere, who have no hope? And I cannot be persuaded that we have moved very far if we're not trying to do something in the way of remedying a society that condemns most of its promising young black men to a life of degradation and a life of despair, unless our society believes that they are inferior mentally and socially. And if we are that, as a society, that demented, we're in terrible shape, worse shape. So if we co-opt a few, permit a few to be president of Morgan Stanley or Time Warner, or to be professors at Duke, and think that that's done something for the many, many millions of blacks who live in this country, who die for this country, and who are dying in this country because of that situation, then I grieve for our society. I mourn for our society. It's very sad. So this is a morning this is one of my pessimistic mornings. One morning you'll find me a little more optimistic, but I don't feel that very optimistic today.
You know, I look back at the pictures of that remarkable 16 or 17-year-old at Fisk, by which I said in jest that you look smug and smart-alecky, but really is an intensity, an optimism, a hope, a quiet kind of resolve and confidence when I think, not in jest, but seriously about that picture. And you have studied injustice and been responsible for commissions dealing with it. You've stood up to it. I know privately things where you have stood up to power, and yet you never seem to have personal bitterness. Where are the well springs of that lovingness that I see in you?
I don't have time for bitterness. Forget what my mother told me.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. No, I don't have any bitterness at all. don't have time for it, don't have energy for it. It takes the energy to be bitter. My cardiologist is interested in my not being bitter. Because, you know, that keeps you from having a stroke or having high blood pressure and all the other things that you have. So I tell him I'm a case study in not being bitter. So I'm not going to let them get me down. And I'm determined.
Are you glad you went into history?
I couldn't imagine my being anywhere else at any other time on this planet than as a historian. Yes, yes, and I can only hope that my father really meant it when he said that just be good whatever you want to be in, and he'll be happy. I think he was.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. There are refreshments outside and an informal reception for those who have enjoyed what, by my lights, was a fascinating discussion with Dr. Franklin. So again, thank you very much for coming.